BAT podcast. We are super excited to kick off the new year with our first episode of 2022. And today I'm with a very special guest, a mover and shaker in the car world and a good personal friend of mine, Mr. Steve Serio.
Hello, Howard. Thank you for having me on. And I had no idea I had the wonderful sort of honor of being the first guest of 2022. Thank you.
So we are thrilled to have you. So are you dialing in from the temperate region of suburban Boston, or where are you at these days?
Yeah, I'm sitting in my office in Boston trying to stay inside today because it's the first really bitterly cold day of 2022, and I guess it's the coldest day since sometime in 2019. So we're not driving anything fun outside today. Thank you very much.
Very good. Well, would love to chat with you about a ton of things today. I know you're doing a lot of really interesting stuff with some really neat cars these days, which I think the community and listeners would love to hear about. Your BAT username, for those who don't know, is fiminod, which I think is pretty well known by the community thus far. You have sold, without looking, Steve, how many cars have you sold on BAT? What's your guess?
I think the transaction between buying and selling, geez, I mean, I think I'm up to selling 83, 4, 5 cars and a couple of piles of parts and a rare set of wheels. So, and I personally have purchased, strangely, have never purchased anything for resale, but have purchased, I'm going to guess, a dozen cars from you guys. So maybe not that many, maybe 8.
You're close. You're close. We got a few in the hopper. You've successfully sold 71, and wow, you've won 11, including some very recently. Actually, I've sold a few personal cars of mine on BAT over the years, and the first or second car I sold actually was bought by yours truly. You'll recall, I think that was back in 2015 or 16, a really cool BMW 2000 TII touring bodied Alpina with all the Alpina bits, and you were the lucky winning bidder. That was a cool car, huh?
That was a very cool car, and I think I resold the car to somebody who was an underbidder and tracked the car the entire time I had it. Yeah, that was a very cool car, and that was my second to last or last 2002 that I ever owned. I think I've owned 13 of the things, and always been a personal favorite car. I finally ran the life out of them. And that the funny part of that car, other than being a great car, being documented to death from the build at Alpina, I found the toolkit buried underneath the carpet, underneath the rear seat that I don't think you knew was there. So that,
oh, dude, we missed that. We missed that. That could have been good for a few more bids.
Yeah, the proper gray vinyl bag with all of the almost rusty tools sitting under the carpet of the rear seat. So is that, wait a minute, I'm confused. The 71 cars that I had up, does that include the no sales? Because we've had a couple of no sales, and I thought all in we were about 80 odd units, but we can go over this later.
We don't like to talk about the no sales, but no, 71 total, 71 total.
Good, okay, fine.
One thing I will say about you, Steve, is that you have something that is rather rare in the collector car world today, and that is actual credibility, that you know what you're talking about. And certainly that's been honed over many decades doing what you do. So I'd love if you can share with the listeners kind of, you were a new Aston Lotus dealer for many years. You play around now with some pretty serious private brokerage of some high level 50s and 60s stuff. So give us a little background on kind of your history and how you came to be.
Yeah, it's the great story of how none of it was planned. In a nutshell, and if people have heard me talk about this on a podcast before, come back in approximately 4 minutes and you can not be bored by this. But 1987, I made the leap almost full time from being a professional photographer to a car. You can either think of it as re-importing Aston Martins to the UK or exporting them back out of the United States. Just simply noticing that old Astons, particularly DB4, 5s, and 6s, were worth twice back in England what they were in the United States. And a great many cars were purchased in the late 70s, early 80s, and brought here because they were frankly worthless, and the dollar was so strong against the pound, it was almost at parity. So folks would travel to England, they'd buy right-hand drive Astons, Rolls Royces, you name it, Jags, and would bring them home. And then they'd realize, well, these things don't, they're not the easiest things to keep running if you don't have a network of people to work on them. And, for a handful of years, traveling on vacation to Europe, I just kept watching the trend of, if something was $5,000 in the United States, it was 5,000 pounds back in England. And now the pound had almost rebounded to its fullest at 2-to-1 against the dollar. So I just started, because of my love of old cars, and I needed to be able to afford one, how I was going to have a second job to supplement my photography income. So I just go around the country and get newspapers, go to Harvard Square, where there was a great newsstand, and I'd come out with an armful of Sunday classified ads from all over the country and just start calling people. So I pipelined a bunch of cars to a mutual friend in the UK, introduced to me from somebody from the Aston Martin Owners Club. And when the first classic car boom hit, I had a pipeline of Astons. If I were smarter, it would have been a pipeline of Ferraris or a pipeline of Porsches, but it was a pipeline of Astons, and that really got me into the business. And, sort of fast forward 35 years later, I became a Lotus dealer in 1991 because I had a British-centric garage in Massachusetts, and Lotus had gotten my name from a couple of people in Florida, again, mutual friends. So I then put a new car shingle up and was the biggest Lotus dealer for, that and a cup of coffee will get you a big cup of coffee in the 90s. I think I was 4 out of 5 years in the 90s, the biggest Lotus dealer in the country, and had always been chasing Aston Martin as a franchise. I started in 91, knocking on their door, and in 90, at the Detroit Auto Show in late 95, going into 96, was introduced to the folks at Aston, formerly from Lotus, and became an Aston dealer until October of 2020. So that was a good ride. Along the way, there was the original revamp of Bugatti. I did that launch in Boston. Right after we did the launch, the whole thing folded, which was a shame because that was associated with Lotus. I was a Vespa dealer for a long time and learned how not to do something. Spiker, Celine, I threw my name in a lot of hats just to try to keep the new car business fun. But the entire time that was going on, the old car business was driving the bottom line. So that was really, it was Aston centric for a very long time. And then and then markets ebb and flow. And I tried to be a chameleon and really get into markets that were, warmer. And as I've told the story a couple of times, when we took that big hit in September of 08 or 09, whenever the markets collapsed, I think it was 09. By the time mid 2010 happened, I came very close to sort of closing my doors, going, well, the collector car business and the new car business was tanking. And then I just, again, decided, instead of focusing on pedestrian classic cars, I have all the contacts around the world. Why don't I just focus on the really hard to find stuff? And the classic car market again picked up, thankfully. And I was in the midst of a real Ferrari bender on single seat Formula One cars, Indy cars. One was an Indy car. You know, things like 340s, 375s, an occasional 410, and then we rolled into 500 mondials. You know, anything that was super rare, I had the contacts for, and I just focused on that, and that ran hot for a very long period of time. As everybody knows, the Ferrari market, you know, it tends to cycle, and there's a lot of big Ferraris that I wish I had owned and kept one or two of them, or had the ability to keep one or two of them. And then, you know, that again morphed when that market got quiet. It morphed into, you know, focusing on things like, you know, a couple of GT40s, the 300 SLs, Lancia Aurelia Spiders, you know, you name it. And then it changed again into aluminum and plastic Porsches for the last handful of years, and working very closely with the guys at Road Scholars. By again, none of this was planned. It just sort of happened. That's where the last few years have been, and it's been great. It's been, you know, if I could have another couple of years like this, Howard, we've talked about retirement before. I could retire earlier, and you could retire earlier. We can go travel and party somewhere. So that's a rant.
You've definitely been doing some interesting stuff with old Porsches, which I definitely want to come back to. Is it safe to say that if you sign up to be a Lotus dealer, you're pretty deep in kind of the enthusiast end of the pool? I can't imagine that a lot of people say, I want to get rich, so I'm going to be a Lotus franchise dealer.
Oh, God, no. I mean, again, it's all dumb happenstance. And the Lotus franchise for me helped me grow my business by hiring a couple more technicians, hiring a proper salesman. And then, you know, it was an incremental thing, you know, and at the time, you know, Lotus had a sweet spot where they were coming out of the 4-cylinder cars when I got involved. When I first got involved, we were actually selling the 1991 Elan, which was a real Harvard Business School lesson in how not to do something and overprice a product and then launch it at the same time the Miata was launched and the Ford Capri and the Metro and every other little tiny 2-seater. So the Elan got crushed, but it was kind of a cool car. It wasn't a $40,000 car, but it was a very cool thing. And they were killing it with the 4-cylinder Esprit, because really the 4-cylinder turbo Esprit and the F40 were the two quickest things on the road at that time, which is real oddball trivia. So if you think of what an F40 is worth today, and you think about you're getting the same bang for the buck if you're measuring it in a straight line, the 2.2 liter Lotus engine was the most efficient motor you could buy per liter. Again, we're getting into the weeds here, but you know, when they made the S4 and the S4S going into 95, they were kind of really running with the ball. Then the V8 came out. That was a hot seller because everybody thought it was going to be a better car, and frankly, it wasn't. And then I rode the coattails of selling the Elise and the Exige when they were launched in the United States, and that was a blast. That was just making, you know, sandwiches and selling them over the counter. It couldn't have been easier. Along with the, you know, sort of coinciding with that, I got the Aston franchise, and the DB7 was launched, which was a car that didn't have any competition at that time. Bentley wasn't doing anything in a sports car. Mercedes wasn't doing anything in, you know, they were doing SLs, but none of them were manual transmission. So, you know, manual transmission, i6, DB7, going into the DB7 Vantage, you know, V12, then going into the GT, there was some real fun momentum there. And again, yeah, no, I wasn't retiring on these sales, but you know, having a DB7 parked in a showroom next to a DB5 convertible, next to a DB4 GT, next to, you know, a Lotus Esprit made for, you know, a very interesting little showroom. And we were dealing with the micro niche geeks of the world. You know, it was fun. And then Aston hit their stride in the early 2000s with the first generation Vanquish, which was and still is a great car if you can find one that's well maintained. And then they came out with the V8 and the DB9, and that to me was like a 3 or 4 year period where, again, like Lotus selling the Elise, everything we had we could sell. And then, you know, they kind of went a different path that I wasn't interested in following. So, wasn't why I didn't get into selling Aston Martins to sell DBXs. So I lost interest on a couple of different levels. The trucks were not where my heart was at, and management would always clutch defeat from the what is it? They'd snatch defeat from the jaws of victory every time they were getting momentum. So
well, they also had the Isuzu contract with those eye marks with handling by Lotus, right? That was before their 90s initiatives when they started making some cars that people actually wanted to buy.
Well, I mean, Lotus, unknown to most people in the automotive world, if you're not in the weeds with it, is an engineering company. They're not, manufacturing to Lotus for decades was what kept their name in the automotive world. But, they were doing manufacturing for the big three. They were doing it for trains in Japan. They were doing it for trucks. They were doing stuff for Isuzu. Suspension tuning and handling was Lotus's gig. And that's why their cars always felt, Julia Roberts knew it in Pretty Woman. This is on rails. Let me drive this thing. And that's what they were all about. They weren't about building wonderful volume cars. And now that's what they're planning on doing. So again, hey, I wish them all the luck in the world. They were kind to me for decades.
You have a lot of experience trading in vintage Aston Martins. I would say probably the or maybe the most significant car you've sold on BAT was, you'll recall, that 63 DB4 Series 5 Vantage, which sold back in September of 2021. I'll say that, I'd say I know a little about a lot of different cars, but my vintage kind of DB4 and DB5 knowledge is a little light. And for whatever reason, specifically with vintage Astons, I think that, real expertise is not that widely known. And I would consider you somewhat of an expert with those. And, unlike more kind of meat and potato stuff where there's a lot of people that, have a broad base of knowledge for a variety of cars, for stuff like, Aston and Rolls and other stuff, but specifically Aston Martin, there ain't too many people around that really truly are experts and know what they're talking about. So tell us a little bit about, would you agree with that? And kind of the vintage Aston Martin market more specifically, that's not the easiest car to, for example, put in an online auction and represent intelligently and answer questions intelligently, that you'd be able to do, maybe more easily with something else.
Well, that's very kind of you. I mean, expert's a funny word because I would never refer to myself as an expert in anything other than having opinions, of which you're very well aware. And I generally, if I talk long enough, I will shoot myself in the foot and I will say something completely inappropriate. But giving an opinion is what it's all about. And yeah, there are other people in the United States. Lance Evans, a restorer in Pennsylvania, has been around forever. He's got a great staff. Kevin Kay out in Redding, California, I'd give a big shout out to, because Kevin is, Kevin is, he's a great restorer. And then I defer to people in the UK, Nicholas Me, and there's a few other folks that have been around really a great long time, Desmond Smale, Peter Stratford, that I've learned a lot of things from, and I just absorb. So I think through being the biggest, I was a whale in the mud puddle of the Aston world for a long time. And I gave Steve Wakefield from Simon Kidston's place a quote the other day where he was asking me why I got involved with Porsches. And I said, if there's somebody that wants to buy an Aston Martin, chances are there are 50 people that want to buy a Ferrari and there are 1,000 people that want to buy a Porsche. So if you're dealing with Astons, you're unless you have a complete James Bond fetish, I went through my entire Aston career listening to people call them Aston Martins. They're so understood, if that's redundant, but they're so well understood in this country. So yeah, I mean, I get it. I like the cars. I've always had a warm spot for them. I've always owned one, for a great many years. And to your question, going back to that Vantage that I sold with you guys, I can put a little bow around my relationship with Bring a Trailer. because of that car. It's a funny thing. I had that car. That car is very close to me because that car almost single-handedly got me interested in being an Aston Martin dealer. It was owned by a very close friend of mine here in Boston. And it's the first real Aston I got to study up close in the early 80s. I had seen a couple of cars on the streets and, you know, had talked to a couple of owners, but met this guy that owned this car, and he had had it since the mid 70s. He was the third owner. And it's, as it turns out, it's a bit of a holy grail car in the Aston Martin world. It's a left-hand drive DB4 Series 5 Vantage. I think there were 17 of them, you know, and they're very rare things. And what they really are is it's the first form of a DB5, except it's lighter. The lines are a little bit different. You know, it's a very cool thing. So I gladly bought that car back from a fellow I sold it to in 2004 in California, and he wanted to sell it. I think I paid him 5 times what I sold it to him for, certainly 4.5 times, maybe 5 times. So he was happy. I got the car back here, and it was the typical thing where a Ferrari shop had done some things wrong on it. We spent kind of 3 or 4 months diddling with it when my techs had a little bit of time on their hand, and we improved all the things that were probably wrong with it since the mid 70s, and things I didn't catch first time around, 17 years ago. So, the car was very dear to me, and I thought, this is a really valuable thing, and I'm going to look forward to selling it. So I put it on the market for $795 was the asking price. And, on big cars, I tend not to really advertise them widely. I tend to talk to people about them. And I had 2 folks come in and really kick the tires hard. And then one ended up buying a very significant Ferrari, and another one ended up buying a boat. So I thought, all right, why don't I try to put this on your site as a really heavy car? I've seen some SLs do great numbers. You had some other, Ford GTs, and you had already proven that you could sell $1 million cars. And I did really well selling a 250 PF coupe to a fellow in Europe on your site prior to this. So I thought, okay, well, let's give it a shot. In the worst case scenario, hundreds of thousands of people are going to see this car for $99. So I think it was a 14-day auction. When the auction came to fruition, I was on I think it was on the Colorado Grand, or I believe that's where I was, and I hit a dead zone. So the auction was finishing. I was following it. It was threatening to get near my reserve. So I dropped the reserve, and then the thing lit. And, it sold for $830,000, proving that, here, what do I know? I've only been selling these cars since 1987, and you guys pull a rabbit out of your hat. That number was, I think I can say this, happily, and get recorded. It was well above the reserve that I had, and it was $35,000 more than my private asking price. So, that was pretty much a grand slam, and proving the power of a platform that is now, I've said it, it's the great disruptor in the auction world, and in not just the auction world, Howard, the world of selling cars through a fancy classified. Because if you boil it down, that's sort of what you have. But you have it, it isn't about Hemmings anymore. It's about 300 pictures, a couple of videos, great presentation, and a gallery full of people where, if they're not derailing your auction accidentally or I suppose purposely, you talk to the peanut gallery, and you be polite with them and answer intelligent questions. It's a great format. So that, you're not plugging me to say this. It's what I believe in.
And on that note, you've really embraced the BAT auction model really since day one. I mean, I think I recall that you were actually a bidder on BAT auction lot number 1, 2, and 3. I think you were bidding on Randy's Stepnose Alpha way back in when was that? July 2014. So No, definitely we appreciate that you've, been a supporter since the beginning. You've sold, I mean, on your fiminod, on all sorts of stuff, E-types, Testarossas, Triumph TR6s, DB4s, 560 SLs, Lancia Fulvias, Rabbit Callaway turbos. Is that kind of indicative of the variety of cars that you deal in kind of weekly, or the kind of the mix looking through your history is pretty neat?
Well, thanks. No, we've always had weirdo stuff here. And I've always tried to own and sell cars that, frankly, you don't have a lot of option. You don't have a lot of options. I mean, I was never a volume car guy. I was never a volume dealer. And I never liked dealing in things that if you had one and there were 30 others on the market, damn well that the guy looking for one is going to look at the other 30. And the way the internet works, you better have the best one and priced aggressively to be successful in a sale. So I'd rather have something that, yeah, there might be another one somewhere, or there might be another 3 or 4 or 5 of them, but try to have the best one or the cheapest one. And yeah, I mean, I go back to when I first started being successful on your site. We had a Lotus Elan that was literally dropped on our door that somebody abandoned and said, I can't deal with this car anymore. I can't fix it. The engine, it was a non-runner. And we thought, let's put it up there and see what it does. We had a Lagonda, which I'm notoriously famous for hating as automobiles. And this one, came from the past owner of, Aston Martin, Peter Sprague, who took really poor care of the car and parked it in a damp garage. And we did okay with it, and I'm thinking early on, listen, if this site can find a buyer for a Lotus with a blown engine and a Lagonda with rust, this is something. And I'll give you the laugh about having bid on Randy's car, lot number 1. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't know about after your final bid, if somebody bids again, there's another 2 minutes. And I had an iPad with me in a car, and I pulled over to make a bid. I was high bidder. The auction ends, so I thought, and then somebody sniped me at the last second. I already put the iPad away and drove home I got home and I looked and I went, I think I stopped bidding at $40,000 and the car ended up selling for around 50 or 51. And I thought, wait a minute, how didn't I end up with that car? And learned very quickly how the rules worked. But yeah, back to your original question. I think the one that hit me again that stands out is a Renault Turbo that I had purchased from another dealer, an R5, and bought a package of cars from him, and thought this, we'll try to advertise this. And I think we had advertised it for 129 and had a couple of really strong hits on it. Had a guy from Los Angeles communicate with us for 30 days. We answered every single question possible, and then he lowballed us, and we thought, you know what? Let's try this on Bring a Trailer. I think the car did 135 if my, lucid memory here is working. So yeah, I try to stick with stuff that, unlike a lot of your I look at guys on your site that have 2 or 3 cars on there weekly and just go, God bless them, because they have created a store for themselves that wipes away having the expense and the responsibility for a proper brick and mortar building, which I don't think you need anymore. I think you need a good videographer, a good photographer. I think you need a good writer, and you need to be honest and photograph, every single corner of a car, because the one thing you don't take a picture of, somebody who's probably not going to bid is going to go, how come I don't see a picture of the back of the rear view mirror? So, I think you find a way to properly display your goods online and save yourself the ass-ache of, a 10 or 20,000 square foot building with a mortgage or a rent and carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned you've done a Porsche stuff for many years. I know that your own personal event car is a 356 Speedster that I've seen you driving on many events over the years. I guess you spend a lot of your time now doing You mentioned working with the Road Scholar guys, but doing private deals and brokerage kind of at the deep end of the Porsche pool, with stuff like 550 Spiders and 904s and 906s and all that great stuff. So I would love to hear a little bit about that and kind of what you're doing in the Porsche world these days. I know you guys are doing some cool driving events and all sorts of stuff. So it's not just the transactional component.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, finding a little niche. I mean, at one point before the Porsche thing, and you said something there that made me think, not just Porsches, but I mean, at one point 3 or 4 years ago, I had 6 Bizzarinis in my building that I had kind of squirreled away and started selling them one by one, because I really believed, along with Chuck Ray from the Mid-Atlantic at Grand Touring, we've been swapping cars forever, and Chuck's been heavily into the Bizzarini and ESO world, and so focusing on those $1 million plus cars again teaches you a lesson that if you can gain knowledge and trust and get into a pool of sellers and buyers in a niche, you can do really well. Because inevitably what's going to happen from this podcast, because it always happens when I do something either with Matt Farah or I do something online, I'll get a text later that says, can you teach me how to do what you do? And I politely say, I can't, because I started 35 years ago. And other than focus on something that you can make a lot of money at, become an expert in it, and own it, and then go from there. I mean, how to be a millionaire is start with $1 million line of credit and get investors and buy and sell cars that way. So I went down a little bit of a fork that I wasn't meant to go down. But back to the cars that matter, working very closely. And the name of my business being Bond Group has nothing to do with James Bond. And I've always managed to make a name for my business that never encompasses exactly what I do. I mean, for forever, everybody thought I was an Aston Martin guy only, or a Lotus guy only. In the entire time, I might have been selling 3 years worth of vintage Ferraris and hadn't sold an Aston. But focusing on a core group of people around the world, and I deal with 6 other guys, and there are 7 of us that talk almost daily, and we try to sort of source out either buyers or sellers of things that are super rare. And so, yeah, last year, I mean, the heaviest car I think I sold dollar-wise was a one-off 250 short wheelbase Ferrari. And then you work down to like the pedestrian $1 million cars, whether they're Mercedes Benzes or Bizzarinis or, some wonderful type of Rolls or Bentley. And going back to my quote about the volume of people interested in Porsches, there's a huge market for great Porsche collectors, and whether they collect 911s, whether they collect 944s, but some of them collect aluminum bodied cars, some of them want GT1s on down. And the lesson there is, if you're going to spend time selling something, I guess I realized this very late in my career, it's just as hard to sell something that's $15,000 than it is for something that's 15 million. It's the same amount of work. So why not go on the bigger margin car? And that's sort of easy to say, having, again, 35 years worth of contacts and, knowing where the dead bodies are in that world. And I've said to people, sort of candidly as clients, if I can't find it, I'm not being grandiose. I can't find everything, but within that group of 6 other guys, if we can't find it in a sensible amount of time, you're just going to have to wait. So I guess I've focused on things that were expensive and valuable and very collectible, because it's just as hard to sell those cars as it's harder to sell my 914.6 than it is one of the few cars that failed on your site, by the way. Because there are so many experts in that field, and there are so many people that will get in your way trying to do a transaction versus, hey, let me work closely with my friends in the Porsche world and go find 2 or 3 550s or 550As or RSKs and get a list of people that want those cars and try to get the customer first, then go find the car. Did I just talk in circles? Is your head spinning?
Not at all. Talking in circles is what this is all about. So stuff like Carrera Abarth GTLs and RSKs and RS60s. Are there any of those still sitting in barns, or are most of them discovered and known and not hiding in plain sight?
Well, most of them are known. It's funny you mentioned the Abarth, because I've had the pleasure of selling 3 of those 20 odd cars in the last 24, 30 months, and actually sold one of them, again, with my cohorts. I could use a 4th and a 5th one, and those aren't available right now. And I don't imagine they will be, but yeah, a 550 does pop up. And a couple of years ago, a twice entered Le Mans car. I didn't find it. I was tipped off on it by a friend of mine in the UK at a Christmas lunch. And it's all about, again, the people you know. And this car had been off the market and kind of hiding in plain sight for decades. And there were a handful of people looking for the car and trying to buy it. And I just happened upon it. And Cam Ingram and I went out to Germany and inspected the car. Couldn't believe what we found. Had the first opportunity to buy the car, as it was being sold very quietly. And the minute we saw it, we put our hand up for it. And within less than 24 hours, we had 4 people on the car. Within 12 hours after that, one of the guys jumped and said, I'll take it. And then 12 hours after that, another guy said, I'll have it. And he was the bridesmaid. So that stuff exists. There aren't any DB4 GTs that are hidden anywhere. There are no DB4 GT Zagatos hidden anywhere any more than there are Ferrari GTOs. But in the Porsche world, things tend to, because there's a higher volume of them, you can find one in a collection that it might be hiding in a corner somewhere. And this collection is well known, but the fact that the guy has an RS60 or an RS61 and nobody knew it was there is more common. So yeah, they're out there. I wouldn't use the term barn find. The last barn find car was literally in a barn. It was a 550A Spider that I sold to Jerry Seinfeld in the late 2000s, by about 2008. And, that car ended up being one of the most significant 550As. And when it rolled into my shop, it was just a pile. It was a car that needed to be fully restored, but boy, was it all there. And, I'd love to have that car back again for what I sold it to him for 14 years ago. So,
you mentioned focusing on the more valuable stuff, which makes a lot of sense, but you actually do. I mean, you sell 91 Elands and 97 M3s and 944 turbos. So you're doing it all. You are certainly not a value snob, and that makes you, a cool guy, because you're playing with all of it.
Well, I mean, that's the curse of enjoying automobiles. And I owned a Volkswagen thing, and I did have a GTI Rabbit Callaway, and I've had a bunch of Range Rovers and Land Rovers as kind of goofy trucks and things that are not terribly valuable. And I can appreciate a 924 or a 944, cars I grew up with, as much as I can a 2002. So yeah, if it's Howard, let me put my salesman whore hat on for a second and go, can I make money with this? So can I wait a minute, if I can buy this $5,000 car and sell it for $10,000, that's $5,000. That's, if I can buy something for 10 and sell it for 12, that's $2,000. That, I'm not going to pass up on that opportunity. You know, I'd rather buy something for 800,000 and sell it for 900, because again, it's going to be just as much work. I'd rather sell something, you know, find something for 2 million and put a margin in it and sell it above 2 million. But that's that, you know, I'm not a retail snob where somebody will come to me and go, you know, right now, I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying, you know, we're going to put a G63 up on your site. That's a 2018 truck that there's a margin in it. Am I going to, you know, retire off of that? No. I'm working on getting, you know, a brand new, you know, Benz wagon, a S63 as well, and putting it up there from a client because, yeah, it's money that helps pay the rent. It's, you know, it's why I'm turning my old building into a storage facility, because, you know, parking cars at $400 a month it's a business, and not everything can be a multi-million-dollar car sale. So having, you know, feelers and having the octopus arms out, you know, to grab, you know, $20 here and $1,000 here and $500 here, and, you know, still doing the occasional bit of service work here and making clients happy and making a small margin in it. It's all business. And when everything goes through a cycle, and I've been through a handful of cycles, and this, I have to wake up every morning thinking the $1 million car sale thing will come to a grinding halt tomorrow. And if I go into work every day with that fear that those opportunities will disappear, it humbles you into thinking, you know, hey, I'm not going to give up anything. And again, I told you, I was 48 hours away from going bankrupt, you know, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, and just thought, wait a minute, you know, sold my own gull wing, sold my own Carrera 2 sunroof coupe to keep my business going. And when there was, you know, stuff to run out of selling, going, hey, wait a minute, this is very humbling. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, you know, by any stretch of the imagination. Things are good now, but, you know, what goes up comes down. And, you know, this car cycle will happen again. I hope it doesn't for another couple of years, but it's bound to.
Well, that is so true. And success is always rented, never owned, as they say, and the rent is due every month. On the subject of kind of previewing some more interesting stuff you have coming up on BAT, I do think there's a pretty special 60s Zagato body Lancia that is on the horizon. Tell us about that car.
Yeah, that's actually a 1959. That's a sport Zagato, the very first Zagato car for Lancia, that was, you know, really the collectible car. They made 99 of them. I had the car once before. I took it in trade on an Aston Martin DB4. I put it to a new caretaker. I got it back from him, and it's, I think, in many ways, it's the same joy of driving that car, albeit slower and without a lot of competition history, than an Aston Martin DB4 GT Zagato. So if you look at the Aston, which is a, you know, pick a number, $12 to $16 million car, or maybe $10 to $15 million car now, and you look at what these have typically traded at, you know, this car, I think the last time around was about $750,000. I don't know where the market is today exactly, which we're going to let you guys figure it out. But that is typical of the stuff I enjoyed selling. I don't think there's another one today for sale in the US. It's a worldwide market for those cars. There are a lot of buyers for them in Europe. There's buyers for them in the Far East. And, you know, this particular car went through a 6,000-hour restoration at a private garage in Costa Rica, of all places, where the fellow who had it, and I may get some of the details wrong here, he was either the Toyota or Nissan importer for that part of the world, and maybe Honda as well. He was a very, very accomplished race car driver, you know, in an amateur level, and car collector, and had his own team of people restore this car. and we have the full photo documentation of the car being taken down to bare metal. The car I lived with a fellow by the name of Tullius in California for like 35 years, who was very well known in the Lancia world. And my client ended up restoring the car and then gave it to David Gooding to sell, and it failed at auction to sell that year. He traded it to me, and now, you know, full circle, I ended up shaking the car down a couple of times, and here it is. It's a turnkey thing now, and if you'd like a super rare, you know, sport Zagato from 1959, you know, let's try it out. I don't think your site has had one. And again, I think launches on your site kind of fall the way Aston's do. You know, it's maybe a hit or miss thing, but I'm sure there are some Lancia guys that have helped us with the lesser priced Fulvias. They're a font of knowledge and far more knowledgeable, and especially with the technical details than I'll ever be on those cars. So it will be curious. It will be curious to see how the Bring a Trailer audience embraces or disregards this car one way or the other. I'd like to think, you know, we'll do okay with it, you know?
Yeah, certainly. We well, super excited to list that. We've only ever had one other one, which incidentally was totally Aratunov's old car, but a later car, a 63 Sport 3C Zagato that we had a couple of years back. Your car being the earlier car with some earlier Zagato design cues, which I actually prefer. You had mentioned the car market being very strong, which we know that it is. You know, we don't talk a lot about kind of market dynamics on this podcast, although I think a lot of our listeners would love to hear more about that. You know, certainly the super high end stuff is doing very well. We see on Bring a Trailer a huge amount of growing interest in, you know, vintage 4x4s and trucks, Scouts and Blazers and Broncos and FJs and that sort of stuff. But what is surprising to me is the strength in stuff that you thought maybe kind of nestled into its kind of narrow value band, but that has come back up. Stuff like 55 to 57 T-Birds and C3 Corvettes, and even stuff like 76 Eldorados are going nuts. And a lot of those like 70s kind of American sleds, Lincolns and you know, Cartier edition 79 Continental. I mean, who knew this stuff you know, would be booming alongside maybe the more kind of obvious things you'd identify. So I'll throw you kind of an open-ended kind of what do you attribute this kind of, you mentioned the market moves in cycles, which it certainly does. We seem to be going through kind of a peak cycle period now. What do you attribute that to, and kind of what are you seeing in your day-to-day?
Well, you know, it's a great question, and probably one that we could gas on about. For if there were three guys in here, you know, in my world, you'd get, you know, 3 or 4 varying different opinions. But I think overall, there was a little bit of a perfect storm in the last couple of years. And I wrote a couple of, I'll call them op-eds about when COVID hit and the world shut down. You know, the weasels and sharks came out and thought, okay, cars aren't going to trade. Everybody's going to, you know, the whole world is going to get sucked up and go to this Dante's 7, you know, rings of hell, and we're all going to die in the inferno. And, you know, you have to sell all of your stuff at 50 cents on the dollar because everybody's going to lose their job, and IRAs are going to be worth nothing, and the stock market's going to crash. Well, you know, all of those great pontificators were proven wrong. And myself, to a degree, when this first started, I don't know what the tracking would have been from 19 going into 20 and into mid 20 for Bring a Trailer. But I thought, you know, how can this, you guys must have been selling 30 cars a day then. And again, I'm sure you know, and I'm guessing, but it wasn't anything like the volume of what you're doing now. And I actually thought there's got to be a malaise. There's got to be a Bring a Trailer malaise, you know, Monday through Friday before you guys went 7 days a week. And there has to be a slowdown. Well, okay, so color me completely 100% wrong. COVID hits, it goes through 2020 into 2021, and the tsunami of interest in old cars grows and grows and grows. And it's as if you took people that had never bought cars before and you coupled it with a pandemic, you coupled it with people looking at their own mortality, and then you threw in the fact that although a great many folks in the population suffered, and certainly if you're in the hospitality business, you suffered, and if you were one of the hospitality workers, or there was a lot of suffering going on, but folks that were relatively well heeled that had some cash might have been in businesses that grew. And so now you've got this great melting pot of the perfect storm, where everybody who was interested in cars and folks that really were peripherally interested are all getting more interested because they're locked down and they're studying and they're looking at screens and they're watching things and they're thinking, what am I waiting for? So I think there's a lot of that, what am I waiting for, in the lesser priced cars and the things that you wouldn't have predicted, like those big 70s sleds. I mean, I have friends that absolutely love big Ford 2 and 4-door cars from the 70s that might have been cars that were $5,000 to $7,500. I mean, if 10 grand might have been a reach for one of those things a few years ago, and now those same cars are bringing $20,000, $25,000, $30,000. So I think with the information going out to the world daily, and with the power of the internet, you take the audience from, call it your Barrett Jackson audience, you take the folks that live in the middle of the country, and the middle of the country is 95% of the country. I'm saying 100 miles in from each coast, and now you've got them on board watching every day, and they're not buying the GT3 Porsches and the GT2 RSs and the Ferrari 360s and 430s and all of those cars that have gone bonkers, and they don't care about gated shifters and they don't care about anything foreign. You look at all those American cars, I wouldn't have guessed that any of the stuff from the 50s would have bounced, and it's bouncing to a ridiculous degree. And then that's going into the 60s and dragging everything, probably age-wise and romance-wise, into the 70s and 80s and the Radwood stuff, where people are going, hey, I grew up with this stuff now. Isn't it cool to have a Rolls-Royce Shadow? A car that, it's got certainly a ton of presence, but those cars weren't terribly desirable things for a decade, and now they're along with, I don't know, you talked about those Bronco builds. I am, as a car enthusiast, dumbfounded every time I see a Coyote, and I can't even tell you what a Coyote engine is. I can now. If you'd asked me a while ago, what's, you're going to put a Coyote engine in something? I'm like, oh, we mean like Wile E. Coyote? What Coyote are you talking about? There's a whole world of guys going, I'm going to build Broncos and sell them for $100,000. I'm going to build Rovers. And now guess what? I always giggled at the fact that people would pay up for a North American spec Rover that you could buy for 10 cents on the dime in Europe. And now all those cars are coming over here, and they're not being poo-pooed anymore. They're not being, shunned because, oh, geez, it's a turbo diesel. Yeah, okay, you get parts in England instead of at your local Rover dealer. There's a broadening at you. Are you doing 70 cars a day? Is that what it is? Something like that?
We are. We're up to 80 or 90 on some days, so it's grown a bit.
Okay, well, you take 80 or 90. They're not all different because they're redundant choices sometime, and I know that's probably a little bit of, you can only sell, like any other auction platform, you can only sell what people give you. But you look at those choices of things and you keep bombarding the marketplace with them. And I've got friends that have told me, I have to give it a week. I gotta stop for a week. because I get sucked in and I look at everything, and I'm killing an hour a day staring at cars I had no idea I had interest in buying. And I think that's a little bit of the answer to your question, along with the perfect storm. You're presenting things in such a way that you can't bring a trailer can't create the market, because they're not, you guys aren't writing the check any more than a Haggerty Price Guide or a Kelly Blue Book. But what you're doing is you're offering up things at such a level where people around the world are going, holy moly, wait a minute, I didn't know I could buy one of these Vista Cruisers. And, I've never had one in Ireland. I've never had one in Belgium. I don't know where your cars are going, but, you tell me. I mean, your cars, how many different countries do you guys have registered now for people buying cars? Not just people, I know people, because you can see where the cars are getting listed from when they're for sale, but it would be great to see where they're going. Two things. That would be great. This is a great idea. You list the country to where the car is going with your buyers, and then shut off the peanut gallery every time a car is over $100,000 in the last 2 minutes, like you guys did on the CGT.
Yeah, no,
that's my suggestion.
In answer to your question, we're still primarily North America based, but certainly have a meaningful and growing user base in Western Europe, obviously in Canada. We actually sold a GT2 Club Sport out of Hong Kong a few weeks back. We've sold some cars to and out of Australia, some to the Middle East. So yes, it is certainly a global marketplace, as you know.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing to me. So to answer your question, I think as long as you can involve the masses, and car collecting is not just for super rich, 1%, the 1%ers. If it's for the 20%ers, and people that have retirement money, young guys that don't have mortgages and families yet, pick your audience. I took one of my kids, he's in a bowling league, and took him the other day, and immediately, my son said something about me being in the car business, and I had 3 20-year-old guys showing me their videos of modified, Fast and Furious cars, Japanese tuned things, or pickup trucks that they had lowered. And there's a whole audience of guys, that I think skipped a couple of years. I thought for, if you went to a forum, maybe in 2017 or 18, the big fear was, Jesus, is this going to bleed down through another generation, or is collecting cars going to go away? And boy, it isn't. And, these guys couldn't have been more jacked up to talk to the old guy in the room about, cars. And frankly, I knew nothing about what they were showing me. I was just sitting there going, explain this to me. What engine did you put in this? There was a Honda powered Bug-Eye Sprite that one of the guys had done. It was like, wait a minute, that's like a Civic engine in a Bug-Eye Sprite. Oh yeah, we're going to turbocharge it. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. So there's all this enthusiasm, and all of those guys knew your site. I don't know whether they're going to buy anything ever, but they know the site. So, it's kind of in my old term, if you took Hemmings from back in the day, and you took Craigslist and eBay, and you plucked all the best cars out every day and put them online for you to visually, car porn, brother. Let's go. I'm going to kill my time looking at my car pornography, and I'm going to sneak an hour at work, and I'm going to sneak an hour, when I have some time at home, I'm just going to go look at this, and I'm not going to show my wife what I'm doing, or my girlfriend, because she's going to kill me if I buy another car. I don't know. It's hitting a wave, and I guess the smart people will try to predict what the wave is going to be with the next cars. I can't tell you. If I were that smart, you'd be talking to my assistant. I'd be retired sitting with my feet somewhere in the ocean. But it's interesting. Quality always sells. And if you got a quality product, no matter what it is, to your point about selling things that are not expensive, I'll sell a quality $10,000 car. As well as I will a multi-million-dollar car, because there's somebody out there that'll buy it and appreciate it and love it. So, look at, Dana Meekum, brother. He's the biggest guy in the car world. A lot of Dana's cars are and this is not disparaging, they're pedestrian things, but they're good pedestrian things. And boy, is he a smart guy. He is the Walmart of the, live auction world, because, Dana is, I wish I had his magic algorithm 20 years ago, because you'd repeat it and you'd go, whatever that guy is doing, it's smart. And whatever you guys are doing, it's smart. And you're bringing more and more people into the fold every day. So the longer you keep doing it, the longer I can keep doing it. The longer I can keep earning a living in this space.
Well, there you go. Steve Serio, your thoughts and insights are always appreciated. You and I, give it enough time, could probably talk without interruption late into the night. So I'll let you go.
Well, we haven't we before? Wasn't this supposed to be just lunch? What are we doing? It's 10 o'clock at night. Why are we still talking?
Thank you for taking the time. I know our listeners will really enjoy hearing what you have to say. And we'll have to have you back later this year if you're up for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for having me on there. Thank you for being a tool in my sales toolbox. And I'll try to bring some interesting cars to your platform, and I hope you guys try to sell them and your audience tries to buy them. So thanks very much for having me on here. I'm honored to be here and a guest of, and you and the whole Bring a Trailer family.